Hi class, and welcome back to another lecture for Psych 101. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 12, Social Psychology. Now, one thing to note about this chapter is there are a lot of pieces of social psychology that the book likes to talk about here. I'm going to do my best to summarize a good number of them. However, if you do have any questions about the book, let me know. Additionally, I do have some kind of in-class activities to discuss in class. And additionally, on top of that, we are going to spend a good amount of time talking about stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination for the in-portion lecture. So if you do have questions about any of this, I would come prepared to ask them, as we're not going to spend too much time on them. With that in mind, in terms of announcements, other than the office hours, which hopefully you know by now, recognize that your reflection 3 for the cognitive pillar will be due on the day of synchronous class, so make sure you are working on that. So without further ado, let's jump into what we are talking about. And first, that is just, what is social psychology? In social psychology, the definition I use is how a person's behaviors, thoughts, and feelings are influenced and influence those around us. And those around us can be people we see, people we know are there, people we imagine are there, or we even think of kind of an implied presence of others. So, they don't have to necessarily be there, but things like cameras or a one-way mirror might be a reason that we are focused specifically on thinking somebody's there when they're not. And we can imagine how that might influence us as well. So, often regarded as the founder of social psychology, a man named Kurt Lewin came up with a really brilliant formula to describe how social psychology works. And really, if we think about this, what we're looking at is the power of the situation and how the situation impacts us and changes what we do. And his formula was pretty simple, was B equals the function of P and E. And all this means is that our behavior, B, is a function of who we are, that person, and the environment we're in. Now, there's a lot of times where our environment is the overriding factor. So, for instance, when you come to school, right, you do certain things, right? You sit there, you take notes, you follow along, you raise your hand when you're supposed to, you talk in turn, and that is your environment playing a big role in how you choose to act. Now, however, I know maybe not everybody wants to be in class every day or is always paying attention, but there are personal differences, right? What you choose to wear to class, what you choose to say, how you take notes, and recognizing that those factors, both our environment and who we are, matter. So I teach on this, actually. I also mentioned this in my personality lectures when I teach on personality, because think about how situations really influence what we can do and how powerful they might be. No matter what kind of person I am, if my house is on fire, I'm going to try to get me and my family out. But, I should say before I go on with the but, that is going to be an extremely environmentally focused situation. But in terms of who I am, right, the type of person I am is probably going to choose the environments I get in to help me choose things like who I'm going to marry, who, I choose to spend my time with, what I decide to do with my life. So recognizing that who we are is this impact between the person in the situation. So in terms of where we're going today, we're going to spend some good amount of time talking about social influence, which I think is one of the most fun and interesting things we can talk about in psychology. We'll talk about social norms as well as different ways that we're influenced in terms of conformity, compliance, and obedience. We'll then spend some time talking about how we can explain people's behavior, talking about things like the fundamental attribution error. We'll talk a bit about attraction and relationships, and then I'm going to end the class with just a hair into dipping our feet in the water on this idea of prejudice and discrimination, which we will pick up with and probably spend a good amount of time in class talking about this. So without further ado, let's talk about social influence. And social influence really is the way in which other people influence us. So how the presence of others influences our behaviors, our feelings, and our thoughts. So think about the ways in which other people might influence what you think, what you do, how you feel, and recognize that there are a lot of places where having a person there or not is going to change how we act. I often like to think about this just as the collection of ways that people impact one another. And one of the biggest, most influential ways this are by what we would consider these kind of unwritten rules we have in life. And these unwritten rules are a way that we know how to do certain things, and they're called social norms or learned cultural rules. So a good example of this would be understanding just how to kind of queue up in a line, or where to sit in class, or how to order food. These are the ways in which we learn to do things. So oftentimes we follow what other people do, but sometimes we end up breaking social norms. And I ask here, what are some classroom norms, which I hope we'll be able to answer in class? And how are some of these norms changed based on things like COVID? So we will hopefully be able to talk about that in class, but let's move on and talk a little bit more about different types of norms. So social norms are learned cultural rules, and we have two types. One are what are known as injunctive norms, so how people should behave. Whether or not you know this, the Don't Mess with Texas kind of tagline is actually registered to the Department of Transportation in Texas, and it's specifically an anti-littering ad. So, we know as an injunctive norm that's sometimes written down, but oftentimes implicit. You don't leave your trash wherever it is. You take it to the trash can. However, we don't actually always behave that way. Sometimes we do what are known as descriptive norms, actually describing what people do. And then I ask, what happens when people break norms, and what happens when we break norms versus when other people break norms? Something that I hope we'll chat a little bit about in class as well. But there are other types of norms. Think about personal space, right? There's no specific wording in any kind of law book that says we need to stand X amount of distance apart. However, culturally, we have specific amounts of distance that we like to keep from one another. And of course, this example has now completely changed given our current situation that we're experiencing globally. Originally or previously, we would say that maybe 4 feet was considered our personal space. Americans typically don't like people coming too close to them when just chatting, and anything within that 4 feet of space might be considered kind of encroaching. However, I would expect this has actually changed a lot, given what we know now about the coronavirus. So recognizing that these rules are implicit, they're kind of implied, they're maybe not written down, but they often change. And they're really useful to maintain and establish order, right? If we look at a picture like this, there's really nothing stopping this person from continuing on to drive right through. There is an octagon that's red and painted with 4 letters. There's a line on the road, but there's no, you can break those, You don't have to stop if you don't want to. You should. Let me be very clear. You should stop, if you don't want to prevent an accident. The double lines in the middle of the road, they're not a force field that stops you from crossing, but they are something that we have made, more or less a social norm, We've enshrined it in laws, actually, that helps us to maintain social order. You don't see people driving in the middle of the road. They stay in the lines, typically. However, there is an issue with this. Sometimes we mindlessly follow these norms, We just go along with the flow, and this can be a problem. And one thing that we can talk about with this is what is known as the Nuremberg defense, This idea that Adolf Eichmann, if you know anything about the post-World War II trials of the Nazis, he was a high-ranking Nazi official, and he would respond to why he did the war crimes he committed as, I was just following orders, And this really explains this idea of social influence, I think, in an important way. That when we're ordered to do something, we have a strong belief that we need to obey those commands. And we will talk about why that social influence seems so strong here. So not only is that a problem, but another problem I want to mention is this idea of de-individuation. So we have specific social norms, Don't loot, don't riot. But sometimes we can become a face in the crowd and lose our sense of self and who we are. Not only that, but we can lead to this idea of diffusion of responsibility, where we fail to take responsibility for an action because, hey, somebody else might help. Most people know this as the bystander effect, The idea that If you see somebody hurting or something wrong, right, this person seems to be laying in the street, we can see that everybody else around them is saying, well, somebody else will help them. I've got other things to do. I'm late for work. It's not my problem. And we have now made who is responsible for this person, right? This responsibility, we've diffused it. In the same way, if you put a single drop of like food coloring in water, it diffuses out and it gets maybe a little bit lighter, and every part of it has this kind of color. We diffuse the amount of responsibility. We say somebody else can deal with it, and we don't necessarily deal with it ourselves, causing some real problems. Additionally, I have a video to show regarding diffusion of responsibility in class. So hopefully that will make some more sense when we talk about it in class as well, if you do have any questions. So beyond social norms, when I talk about social influence, we have 3 types of major social influences, these kind of factors that influence how we decide to live our lives. And I'm going to start talking about the most basic or weakest type of social influence, which is still pretty strong, and talk about how they kind of grow in terms of strength throughout. So the first type of social influence I'll talk about is conformity. And conformity is how we conform or kind of become part of the group, how we do as others do. So we often change our behavior in response to pressure from others, but not necessarily questions from others. For instance, if you walked into class and every single person was standing up at their desk, this is something I like to do during my synchronous classes when we're back in person, is I usually send somebody out of the room and I say, go get a drink of water. And I tell them to come back in a minute. And I tell everybody else, okay, stand up and start taking your notes. And let's see what happens when this person walks back. And what always happens is they grab their notes and they stand up, right? So they see that everybody else is standing up and they say, well, maybe I'm supposed to. It doesn't make sense why people do this, but they look at what other people do, and there is a pressure to be like those in the group. And so we might conform and do what other people are doing without even being asked. Beyond that, though, things like compliance, doing as others want. This is going to be a change in behavior based on an explicit request. So something like, can you take your hat off, please? That might be a way that, we have a social influence. There are a lot of different things that we can ask from other people. Not necessarily that they'll do it, but we can ask people, and maybe just asking has that extra amount of pressure on it. Now, the most strong version of social influence is this idea of obedience, so doing as others command. And really, the only difference between compliance and obedience, the difference between compliance and obedience is who is asking. With obedience, we are obeying an authority figure. We are responding to an explicit request again, but this has to be from somebody in charge. So whether that be a professor, the person running an experiment, the government, a police officer, anybody who has some kind of authority over you. Starting with conformity, though, just some quick things about this, We conform a lot. One thing that's probably too dated now is if anybody remembers Crisscross, this was a band back in the 90s, and they used to wear their clothes backwards. And what was so interesting about this is people would come to their concerts, as I have here in the bottom, dressed in their clothes backwards, kind of like they did. Nobody asked anybody to do this, but people changed their behavior, changed the way they wore their clothes to go to concerts with this. Not exactly a concert example, but another big group example, though this doesn't have to be big groups, is at A&M, their colors were maroon. Mainly everybody wore maroon. And when you would go to a football game, you were expected to wear maroon. Now, no, this never said anywhere on any piece of paper, wear maroon. But look at all of the sea of maroon, and then you've got one person in here, and you can really just tell it's very overly colored in maroon here. This is suggesting that people will conform. So maybe the first time you go to a game, you look around and you see you're not in maroon. You go, oh, this is wrong. But then you start doing it every time after. I don't know if this is as strong at Stetson, as I haven't been to any sporting events due to this, but I would expect that generally people will fall in line. If Stetson is a school that really prides itself on school spirit and school colors, probably most people will wear green to this as a way to kind of be part of the crowd. Not only this, but you see people can actually just begin to line up, not necessarily knowing what they're queuing for, but assuming that they're queuing for the right thing if they see people lining up. So there's a lot of ways in which we conform. And my question, though, is would you find conformity in a clear situation, right? Maybe where you know something is going to happen. Well, yes, of course. This is called normative social influence. We want to be liked. We want to gain rewards. We want to avoid punishments. We want to follow norms. We want to be typical. We don't want people to have a reason to dislike us. We're motivated to be accepted by the group. We conform, right, to fulfill others' expectations of us, to seem like normal people, to seem like people who shouldn't be exiled from a group. And really, this is a lot, right? In one way, we can consider this peer pressure, that we are pressured by other people to be, right, part of the group. Now, there's some more that we'll talk about in class on this, but that is the general gist of this. When we talk about compliance, again, we are talking about changing one's behavior in response to a direct request. So this could be as simple as, hey, do you mind passing the salt? However, I want to talk about two specific ways in which compliance can really be kind of cranked up, and we can get more kind of agreement from people. And these are tactics that are often thought about with like salesmen. So if you are interested in, or if you know anything about the kind of old school, like door-to-door salesman, the wording of these two techniques might make a lot of sense to you. So the first one I'll talk about is the foot in the door technique. So imagine that you are a traveling salesman and you want to sell vacuum cleaners, and you've got a $300 vacuum cleaner you're trying to sell. How many times do you think if you knock on somebody's door, they're just going to let you in and sell them a vacuum cleaner? Well, probably not as many as you'd like. So what you do is you just start out with a small request, just enough to get your foot in the door. So you might say, hi, I'm selling vacuum cleaners here. Is there any way I could borrow like 5 minutes of your time? Just a small request. And so you might decide afterwards, hey, once you're in there, can I actually get another 5 minutes to demonstrate how well the vacuum cleaner does? Here, I'm going to show you how it works on your carpet. It's going to take a couple more minutes, but maybe that. And well, now that you've seen this, why don't you try it out? And here, why don't I leave you my card and give you this vacuum cleaner for a couple days, and I'll come back and we can discuss prices. Working your way up to bigger and bigger requests to try to sell this vacuum cleaner. So another example of this, right? Say that you want to eat a pie. And you have a pie. You might first ask for one slice of pie. And you might first ask for one slice of pie before asking for another and another and another, and eventually getting half or whole, right, the whole pie. Because probably if you asked for that much pie at the beginning, nobody's going to let you, right? Hey, Mom, do you mind if I eat half a pie? No, you're not allowed to do that. So you might start with one piece, then another, then another. So that's the foot in the door technique. Start small and then work your way up. Now, on the other hand, we have the opposite version of this. This is the door in the face technique. So this would be more or less asking somebody for such a huge request that they can't realistically do it, and then asking for a smaller one. So with the pie example, hey, Mom, can I eat a whole pie? What? No, that's ridiculous. You can't eat a whole pie. Well, how about half of a pie? Okay, well, that's a little bit better, but, right, it's not great. So back to the example I used about the salesman, right? Maybe this person knocks on your door and says, hi, selling a $300 vacuum cleaner, saying, hi, I'm looking to sell this vacuum cleaner. Would you be interested in it for $500? And they slam the door in your face because nobody's buying a $500 vacuum cleaner. So then you might knock on the door again and you say, I'm sorry, that was probably too high, but actually I realized I can sell this to you for $300. Now, isn't that a deal? And so it looks better I had a student I was teaching in social psychology once say that they sold knives to people, and they would always start out with the $3,000 deluxe set of knives. And everybody would go, I can't pay for that. They would say, oh, it's okay. We have like a $75 collection of knives that are similar, but not quite as fancy. And the person I was talking to was just like, it worked every time that they would make a sale. So suggesting that this is another good way to have people comply with us. However, we don't need to do these two specific types of techniques to actually have compliance. We can just ask people, right? Hey, do you mind doing this? And sometimes that will just work as well. Moving on to obedience, or our strongest type of influence, right? This is changing our behavior in response to a demand from an authority figure. Now, some questions that I have for this, usually during my in-person class, but some questions that you ought to be able to ponder are, would directions from an authority figure lead a person to behave in ways that they would never do? Absolutely, they would. Would ordinary men administer lethal shocks to innocent victims after following an experimenter's orders? We see this as well happening, and this is the Milgram experiment. Now, I'm going to spend time talking about the Milgram experiment in class, but the book does go into it a little, and if you have any questions for it, bring those questions, but we will talk about it during our synchronous class. So that's all I'm going to talk about for social influence, but let's move on and chat about explaining behavior. And to do this, I want to introduce a very, very important term and something that I hope you'll take with you after you leave this class. And this is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is one of the most important things, and I think understanding how this works is really beneficial to catching yourself doing this and seeing how this operates with ourselves and other people. The idea is that we like to be consistent. We like to have our attitudes and our behavior be the same. If I like something, I want to do things that promote me liking it, right? If I like the Avengers movies, you would expect me to go see the Avengers movies. If I didn't like the Avengers movies, but I'd seen all of them, that's not very consistent. Yeah, I went and saw all 30 Marvel movies, but I hate Marvel. Why would you do that, right? That is a dissonant cognition. So when our attitudes and our behavior conflict, people are motivated to change something to reduce this dissonance. And dissonance is a word best described, if you're familiar with music, a dissonant chord is a chord that doesn't sound right. You might not have the right notes. So as a piano player, if I were to put my hand down and maybe have two of my fingers on the wrong keys, the chord is going to sound not correct. It's not going to be harmonized. It's going to be dissonant. So now we have these two cognitions that aren't harmonized. So for instance, I smoke, which I know is bad, but smoking makes me feel good. So how do I change this? Well, as the book talks about, you're likely to change whatever is easier. And so what's easier? Stopping smoking or saying maybe smoking isn't so bad for me? Well, we know that smoking isn't great for us, but it's easier to maybe pretend it's not so bad than it is to actually imagine how bad it is to smoke and to continue to smoke. So we might sweep that under the rug. And this is going to help us to understand a couple of the things that we talk about moving forward in attributions. And we don't necessarily just do dissonance for us, or we do dissonance for us mainly, but for those we like, people around us, we might be willing to forget some details about certain things in order to keep our image consistent of a person. So when we deal with other people, we can ask ourselves, how do we learn about them? How do we develop impressions and understand, right, who are people we should be friends with, who are people we shouldn't be? How do we know, right, who they are? How do we draw inferences about them? How do we know that one person might be better than another? How do we know if people are, right, good, bad? How do we know if they're the world's best boss or not, right? He has a mug. Does that mean he is? Well, watch the show and find out. But one of the most important things regarding attributions, I think, is this idea of a fundamental attribution error, which works within cognitive dissonance. We tend to underestimate how much a situation matters, but we overestimate how much that person matters for other people's behavior. So the very upset bear here makes a very good point and explains the fundamental attribution error in a way that I think is perfect. If I see somebody not using their turn signal, the first thing that comes to my mind is, you're a douchebag, right? You're an asshole. I don't like you. Now, what if I am driving in the car and I have my wife asking me a question and I forget to signal as I move over, right? I'm looking, making sure nobody's there, and I just move over and I forget to signal. Well, that was just a dumb mistake on my part. But I didn't give the other person that same level of slack, right? I said that other person was a jerk for not doing this. But when I did it, I said, well, I had other things going on. I focused on the situation I was in. My wife was asking me a question. I couldn't pay attention. I didn't give the other person that benefit of the doubt, right? He or she definitely should have had their signal on, no matter what. This is a great example of how we might attribute different things to individuals. We might see them as less capable or less likely to be able to do things. Beyond that, though, we have what is known as the actor-observer bias. And the actor-observer bias is this tendency to attribute our own behavior to situational causes and others' behavior to personal causes. So with the actor-observer bias, the best way to think about this is, are you the actor or the observer? If you are observing somebody here, right, you are going to think that whatever they did is based on who they are. Versus when you're the actor, the person doing this, you're going to think that your situation was caused by, right, whatever it is, right, whatever situation you were in. So a good example of this. So imagine that you did poorly on an exam. So if you fail an exam, you are going to think that it necessarily isn't your fault. It's not who you are, but it's the situation. So you might be more likely to say, well, it's the professor's fault. They're just a bad teacher. However, if you do good on that exam, but somebody else does bad, somebody you're observing, you're not going to give that person that same situational benefit that it's the professor. More likely, you're going to say, well, they're just dumb. And this is a huge issue, right? Because we are not exactly looking at the same, or at other people the same way we're looking at ourselves. Now, one more thing to add to this idea of the fundamental attribution error that I think is something we ought to mention as well is the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is the tendency to make internal or external attributions for one's own behavior in a way that benefits ourselves. So if things go good, we say, well, that's just who we are. So we do good on an exam, we say, hey, we must be smart. We do bad on that same exam, we might say, well, it's definitely the professor's fault. So not only do we do this with other people, we do this with ourselves as well. One example, I know it's a lot of text, but after a professional sports game, they saw that 80% of statements made by the victory team, the team that won, was talking about how internal attributions mattered. We worked hard, we tried our best. When the team didn't win, though, about half the statements were about how it was some external cause. Bad calls, the weather wasn't on our side, but not really taking ownership of maybe we just didn't play that hard. And recognizing how all of these might bias our judgments and maybe make us a little less accurate in how we understand other people. However, there's another couple things that I think are fun to talk about here, and one of those is attraction in relationships. And usually I ask people in class, what do you think? Do you think that absence makes the heart grow fonder, or do you think out of sight, out of mind? So go ahead and think which of those you agree with, and with that in mind, let's talk about some factors that might influence this. Well, one factor is this idea of proximity. So in terms of attraction, being near somebody actually is a very important aspect of attraction. This creates the opportunity to meet people, and we tend to be more attracted to people who are near. Now, One cool thing about this, and something I'd like to mention, is this idea of functional distance, that not all nearness is equal. In one study, looking at different interactions between people in a college dorm, the dorms were set up in buildings like this down here. So this building had right, dorm 4 and 5 next to each other, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 up here. But what you'll notice is door 9 and 4 are pretty close to each other. However, it's less likely that these people are going to be friends. What they found, though, was that people who lived next to each other were more likely to talk to one another, but most importantly, people who lived near the bottom of the staircases in 5 and 1, as well as people who lived in 7 and 9, were the most likely to make friends. Why? Because people would walk by those distances and were more likely to actually be able to see people who were similar. The other pictures I have on here really do kind of sell this as well, recognizing this idea of the, quote, girl next door or boy next door being these people who are just close to us. And when we are able to be near people and create the opportunities to meet people, we have what is known as the mere exposure effect. We like things better the more we see them. So if you ever listen to a song and you've maybe thought, hey, this is okay, I don't really know what I think about it. And then you hear it a couple more times and you say, yeah, you know what? I think I really do like that. This is that mere exposure effect at work. So the more often we see or hear or kind of are exposed to things, the more we tend to like them. There are some limitations to this though, right? If you start out on the wrong foot, you're probably going to have a harder time getting on the right foot. So if you make a bad impression at first, it might be made worse with more contact. And the other cool thing about this is that we call this an overexposure effect. If you're exposed to this too much, it might lead to contempt. So for instance, personally, if I ever hear the song Payphone by Maroon 5 again, I think it's going to just kill me inside because I heard that song way too much on a summer I was working. So I would argue that it does seem to be the case that birds of a feather flock together in being, not birds of a feather, that being close to one another is better for attraction. Now, on the other hand, we talk about this idea of opposites attract versus birds of a feather flock together. And what do you guys think? Do you think it's the case that opposites attract, or do you think it's the case that birds of a feather? So some research on that talks about what intimate relationships in love really looks like. And we're going to talk about 3 components and how these end up looking in long-term relationships. So one thing I will say is the research suggests that short-term relationships are very powerful among those who are different, among opposites. However, they're less likely to last statistically. On the other hand, relationships with people who are similar tend to last longer. And this makes a lot of sense. Think about it. Right? If you have similar beliefs about, right, do you want to have kids? What religion are you? What politics you believe in? All the kind of big issues in a relationship. If you agree on those, it's more likely to stay together with that person. However, if you don't, it's going to be more difficult. But let's talk about 3 components of a relationship in love. And one of these components, right, this is the Sternberg triangle, is passion. And passion is these strong, intense feelings, this longingness to be with someone. We might call this infatuation. This could lead to physiological arousal. However, this is not the only thing. And through some research, we see that passion is most powerful at the start of a relationship. But as a relationship drops on, it does kind of dip. Or the relationship moves on, it does kind of dip. However, this is not necessarily that there's no passion left in the relationship. It might just be stronger. So with passion, I like to think about, if you remember Pepe Le Pew, right, this cartoon skunk who was infatuated with this, or just obsessed with this cat that he thought was another skunk. And he just was, I would say, very passionate towards this skunk, or this cat. Now, talking about intimacy, this idea of emotional closeness, bonding, and sharing. Now, people often think of intimacy as physical intimacy, which can be part of it, but when we are talking about this, we are talking about being close. You can be very intimate and sharing, right, secrets and details and emotional kind of, how you're feeling with friends, with significant others, with family, and that is kind of an intimate relationship, somebody who you might share a lot of these close, important details with. And intimacy continues to rise as a relationship increases, and this makes sense as people become more and more comfortable sharing more and more of themselves with another person. Finally, there's this idea of commitment in a decision to maintain a long-term relationship with this person. And we see commitment, again, kind of goes very high up pretty quickly and then mostly stays the same throughout a relationship. And these three components are what make up Sternberg's triarchic theory of love, right? So the idea that it's intimacy, passion, and commitment that all matter here. So thinking about this, right, this idea of liking a person is important to love, but it doesn't have to necessarily be, right, love. But, right, intimacy, this closeness matters. Our infatuation with this person, I have kind of an extreme example over here in the corner, but this can be just generally this longingness or this desire to be with this person, hopefully in a non-creepy way. And then we have this idea of empty love, which maybe is just filled with commitment, right? So these would be two people who get married simply because they believe they should get married. They don't like or have kind of any infatuation with one another. But let's talk about the sides if we start to kind of mix some of these types of love together. Well, a intimacy and passionate love is what we call romantic love. So we can think about this as like the Titanic, right? These two people were, falling in love and were longing to be with one another and were sharing a lot about themselves. We can also talk about companionate love. So this intimacy component with a commitment component. Oftentimes, companionate loves are often thought about kind of like an older couple where maybe the passion isn't as strong. With the bottom two, we can talk about infatuation and commitment, passion and commitment as this fatuous love. And this is a great example of this would be Romeo and Juliet, where we talk about a couple who's known each other for like 3 days, hasn't really gotten a chance to really become intimate and share many details about one another, but has decided to get married and completely be committed to one another without really knowing much about one another. But what do we call it when we have all three of these components in a relationship? This is this idea of consummate love. So, right, a kind of fully well-rounded love which has all three of these components: intimacy, passion, and commitment. Okay, so the last stuff I want to talk about is prejudice and discrimination. And I want to start off this portion of the talk by describing a little bit about me and who I am, because I think it's important to recognize where you're coming from talking about stuff like this. So I grew up in a very rural, very Rust Belt kind of poor area of Ohio that was very, very overwhelmingly white. So from my school, where there was only a graduating class of 99 people, there was only one person of color, two people of color in my grade. They were brothers. One of them actually was the best man at my wedding, great friend of mine. However, the vast majority of the people I grew up around and grew up with my whole life were white. I had very little exposure to people of other races simply just due to my situation. Not that that inherently makes a person racist, but recognizing that I have not experienced many discriminatory or prejudicial or stereotyping kind of incidents in my life. So I recognize that I have a lot of privilege about that. And the conversation I hope to have in this class talks a lot about what is going on today in the news, in our lives, and how learning from psychology might be able to help us here. And with that in mind, the book has this great way to explain the difference between stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, and I think it's important to look at, but an example that I have is take a look at this man here. And there's probably a lot that goes through people's heads when they see somebody like this. And so when we apply this idea of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination to this man, right, prejudice is this idea of a hostile or negative attitude towards people in a distinguishable group. And so this man, we would say, is likely in a distinguishable group, right? He looks homeless. And now that might be a stereotype we have for this person, but we might have a negative attitude. We might dislike this person because they're homeless for no other reason. Additionally, we might discriminate against this person, a more behavioral component. We might take unjustified actions towards or against this group member based solely on that membership. We might deny this person the right to sit in an establishment just based on the way that they're dressed or the way that we see them. We might be less likely to hire them for a job based on the way we see them. And then the stereotyping, this last portion, is the generalization about a group in which certain traits are assigned to virtually all group members. So we would assume, right, if we follow the typical stereotypes of a homeless individual, we might say this person is, right, lazy, doesn't, right, maybe has mental health problems. All of those well, they don't have to be negative, but typically are negative about a homeless person. Stereotypes, which may or may not be true. There are a lot of reasons that right after the 2008 marketing crash, there was a ton of families that were put in a situation which would be technically homeless that don't necessarily fit this description. There are people who can be homeless who do not look it, and we might not know that. So we might only stereotype people we think, and we might not be recognizing that they're people who are different in the group. But all of this comes about based on how we form groups. And the question I want to ask here is look at these two pictures and just think about which one you like better. And with that in mind, right, I ask you, what does it take to form a group? Well, given what I've already asked you on this slide, which picture you like, I can easily split the class into two different groups. Those who chose picture 1 and those who chose picture 2. Cool, you say. You managed to split us into 2. What difference does that make? In terms of the minimal groups paradigm, a lot. So even arbitrary and virtually meaningless distinctions, which picture you choose, between groups can trigger a tendency to favor one's group at the expense of others. Think about it this way. Have you ever been in a classroom where they count off, say 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2? Everybody in 1 over here, everybody in 2 over here, we're going to compete in some game. That's all it takes. And all of a sudden you go, okay, so I want to beat the other team. If you've ever played something like Mario Party, right, in Mario Party, there are mini games throughout the game, and what you're supposed to do is sometimes be matched with people who you were previously fighting against in the major game, but you are working together to to achieve a goal. Even if you know you're fighting against this person on another thing, you might team up with them during that game, right? Minimal groups are all around us. You've been matched with this person. You are now a group. Okay, well, I want to like my group. So why do I bring this up? Because if we can do this with just some pictures like this, how do you think it looks with something like this? Right? This person is definitely not maybe in a group that we would think they belong to with us, but another way we can think about this is they're a person. They belong to that group, and recognizing how little it takes to form groups. So actually, I'm going to cut my lecture there. We're going to talk a little bit more about all of these things in class. If you do have questions, make sure you bring them to class. Otherwise, look forward to seeing you when I do. Make sure you have that Reflection 3 done for the class day. Additionally, your exam should also be finished before class as well. If you do have any questions, shoot me an email. Otherwise, have a great day, and we'll see you later.